It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to get away from the city for a while. I had been living in Leeds for almost 8 years, surrounded by noise, traffic, and the kind of constant movement that wears down your nerves without you even realizing it. I was 32 at the time, single and tired. I needed some quiet. I wanted a place where I could hear nothing but wind and trees. So I booked a small rental cabin in North Yorkshire, near a place called Fisher's Valley, about 40 minutes from the nearest proper town, surrounded by forest and old farmland. The cabin was a small wooden place, tucked away off a long gravel road. The listing photos made it look cozy. A single bedroom, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a back deck that overlooked a stretch of trees and low hills. When I arrived, the air was damp and cool, the smell of pine heavy in the wind. The cabin was older than it looked in the photos, though. The steps creaked when I walked up to the door, and there were patches of wood along the side where the paint had peeled away, showing gray beneath the brown. Inside, it was quiet. No humming of appliances, no traffic noise, no people. Just still air and the faint ticking sound of the ceiling expanding in the afternoon warmth. There was no phone signal. I'd expected that. I had a portable charger, a flashlight, a few days' worth of food, and some books. I planned to spend most of my time reading, walking, and maybe sketching. For the first day and night, everything felt peaceful. The quiet was strange at first, so complete that it made my own breathing sound loud. I could hear the smallest things. A branch tapping against the side of the cabin, the distant rush of a creek somewhere beyond the trees, the occasional crack of something moving in the undergrowth. I told myself it was deer. On the second night, the air felt different, heavy. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, and fog began to roll in from the woods. Came thick and fast, swallowing the trees, pushing right up against the deck rail. I had left a few tools and a folding chair outside earlier that day, so I stepped out to bring them in. The fog was so dense that I couldn't see beyond 10 or 15 feet. I remember how the moisture beaded on my arms, cold against my skin, and how quiet everything had become. Even the crickets seemed to stop. That's when I first heard it. A dull thud, far off at first, like something solid hitting wood. Then another. It came from deeper in the fog, beyond the trees at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't rhythmic like chopping wood. It was irregular. I stood still on the porch, straining to hear, but the sound stopped after a few moments. I told myself it was probably an animal knocking something over, maybe an old fence post or a fallen branch. Still, it made me uneasy. When I went back inside, I locked the door, even though I hadn't planned to. The old lock made a heavy clunk that echoed faintly through the small space. I read for a while, trying to ignore the sounds outside. Every so often, I thought I heard something faint, like soft steps on gravel, but they would fade as soon as I focused on them. I eventually went to bed around midnight, though it took a long time to fall asleep. Sometime after 2 a.m., I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first, but I realized quickly that I could hear movement outside. Slow, careful movement. Footsteps, soft but distinct, crunching on the dry leaves that covered the ground around the cabin. My heart began to pound immediately. I held still, listening. It wasn't an animal. Animals move in bursts, quick and uneven. This was slow, deliberate, one step at a time, moving around the side of the cabin. The boards creaked faintly underfoot. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. The nearest house was almost 2 miles away. My car was the only one on the gravel road when I'd arrived. I lay there, frozen, as the steps paused, then moved again, this time toward the back deck. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. Then I heard the faintest metallic sound, the rattle of the handle on the back door. Just once. A short, sharp clink. Then silence again. My chest felt tight, my mouth dry. I stayed still, waiting for something else. Another sound, another movement, but after a long minute, there was nothing. I got up quietly, grabbed the flashlight I kept by the bed, and switched it on. The beam shook in my hand as I pointed it toward the back door. The fog outside was still thick, white against the window, reflecting the light back at me. I couldn't see anything. No shape, no shadow. I waited there for almost 20 minutes, barely moving, before finally switching off the light. The steps didn't return that night, but I didn't sleep again either. In the morning, I went outside to look around. The fog had lifted, leaving the grass wet and the air cool. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the ground. The soil was soft from the night's moisture, and near the back steps, I saw them, footprints. Human footprints. They weren't boots, just flat, worn-looking prints that were deeper on one side, like whoever made them was limping or dragging one foot slightly. They led from the edge of the trees toward the deck and then back again. I followed them until they disappeared into the woods. I turned around quickly after that, my stomach twisting. I spent most of that day inside, checking the locks, keeping the flashlight close, trying to tell myself it was just some hiker who'd wandered too close. But that didn't explain the footprints circling the cabin, or the handle being tested. That night, I pushed the small table and a chair against the back door. I felt stupid doing it, but it gave me a small sense of security. Around 11, I turned off the lights and sat on the edge of the bed, listening again to the silence. It was colder that night. The air felt sharp. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps, moving slowly around the side of the cabin, just like before. Then the sound of something brushing against the wooden wall. Not scratching, not tapping, brushing, like a coat sleeve sliding across the surface. Then, after a long pause, I heard the soft creak of the deck steps. I stayed completely still. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. Then came the sound that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. A quiet, shallow breath right outside the wall. Not an animal's snort or sniff. It was human, slow and steady. The door handle moved again, this time twice. Then the door itself creaked slightly as weight pressed against it. The chair I'd wedged underneath the handle made a dull thump, and everything went still. After maybe half a minute, I heard the soft crunch of steps retreating, back down the deck, across the clearing, and into the trees. I didn't move until dawn. When the light finally broke through, I packed everything I could into my car in less than 10 minutes. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely zip my bag. When I finally drove down that gravel road, the relief I felt was overwhelming. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. A week later, I got a call from the rental owner. She asked if everything had been okay because the cabin's back door had been damaged. Someone had forced it open sometime after I left. She'd found the door cracked near the lock and a few tools missing from the shed. She said the police thought it was probably a drifter, someone moving through the woods looking for supplies or shelter. That explanation made sense. But I couldn't stop thinking about how deliberate the movements had been, how long they'd stayed outside, and how they'd come back 2 nights in a row. Whoever it was hadn't just stumbled upon the place, they'd watched it. Maybe they'd seen my car arrive and waited for me to sleep. Maybe they thought the cabin was empty the first night, and when they realized it wasn't, they came back later hoping I'd be gone. Sometimes, even now, I think about that night, about how close that thin wooden door came to giving way, about how the only thing between me and whoever was outside was a cheap lock and a chair. When I replay it in my head, the scariest part isn't what happened. It's knowing that if they decided to push harder, there would have been nothing to stop them. I never went back to that area again. I still can't stand the sound of wood creaking at night or the feeling of fog pressing against the windows. And I still wonder what would have happened if I'd opened that door, or if I hadn't woken up in time. It was the winter of 2014 when I decided to rent a small cabin in the countryside of northern England, somewhere near the edges of Northumberland. I had been living in London for years, tired of the city noise, tired of the crowded flats and restless nights. I wanted quiet, somewhere I could breathe and maybe work on the small book I'd been trying to finish for months. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place on the edge of a field, not far from a line of trees that stretched deep into the hills. The owner lived a few miles away, and I barely saw anyone else around. The nearest village was about 20 minutes down a narrow road that always looked damp, even when it hadn't rained. I arrived there on a gray afternoon. The air smelled like wet wood and cold soil. The cabin had one main room with a little kitchen space, a bedroom, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that peeled near the ceiling, and the floor creaked under every step. But I liked it that way. It felt quiet, isolated, perfect for thinking. I unpacked my things, set up my laptop on the small table near the window, and watched the field outside turn dark as evening came down. The first few days went fine. It rained a lot, but that was expected. I spent my time reading, walking my dog through the muddy paths, and making small notes for my writing. There was something calming about the quietness, though sometimes the silence at night felt heavier than it should. The wind pushed against the windows, and sometimes I'd hear the faint sound of branches brushing against the walls. It wasn't scary at first, just nature doing what it does. But by the fifth night, something started to bother me. I had been sitting at the table late at night, typing with a cup of tea beside me. My dog, Toby, had been asleep near the heater. Around midnight, I noticed him wake up suddenly. His head lifted, ears stiff, and he stared toward the window. I thought maybe it was a fox or something outside, but when I turned to look, I couldn't see anything. The outside was pitch dark except for a dim outline of trees under the faint moonlight. Toby didn't growl or bark. He just stared for a long time and then slowly lay back down. I brushed it off, though for some reason, I couldn't focus on my writing after that. The next evening, the same thing happened. Around the same hour, Toby stood up and looked toward the same window. This time, he let out a low growl. I got up and turned on the outside light. It lit up a small patch of the field, but beyond that, everything faded into darkness. Nothing moved. The grass looked damp and uneven, and the trees at the edge swayed slightly in the wind. I stood there for a while, staring into that black space, waiting for something to move. When nothing did, I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down again. But the feeling didn't leave. It felt like someone had been out there, just beyond the light. The next morning, I noticed something strange near the fence behind the cabin. The ground was soft from the rain, and there were faint footprints leading from the trees toward the cabin. They weren't boots or animal tracks, they looked like bare feet. The size looked like a woman's, not very large, and the steps were uneven, as if whoever walked there had stumbled. I stared at them for a long time, trying to think of an explanation. Maybe someone had wandered nearby. There were farms a few miles away. But why would someone walk barefoot through cold, wet mud in the middle of the night? That night, I couldn't sleep. I left the outside light on and kept the curtains shut. Around midnight, I heard it again, Toby growling softly. Then there was a sound, a slow, dragging step outside, like someone walking through wet grass. I froze. I didn't move. My chest felt heavy, and my throat tightened. I slowly reached over and turned off the lamp so the room went dark, hoping to see outside through the small gap in the curtain. My eyes adjusted slowly. There was a figure standing near the tree line. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but after a few seconds, I could see her clearly. A woman, thin, wearing something light-colored that hung loosely from her shoulders. She was standing completely still, facing the cabin. Even from that distance, I could tell her posture was strange. her head tilted slightly, like she was trying to see something inside. I felt my stomach turn. I didn't move. I just watched. She didn't walk closer. She stood there for several minutes, motionless. Then, slowly, she turned and disappeared back into the trees. I barely slept that night. I wanted to pack and leave the next morning, but the weather had turned worse. Heavy rain poured all day, and the roads were flooded in some spots. I told myself maybe it was some lost hiker, someone confused. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The following evening, I stayed awake again, this time with the lights off. I sat near the window watching the darkness outside. Around midnight, I saw movement again. The same figure came out of the trees, walking slower this time. She came closer, step by step, until she stood at the edge of the light from the cabin's porch. The rain was coming down hard, and her hair hung wet and dark over her face. She wasn't wearing shoes. Her feet were muddy, and her clothes clung to her body. She wasn't looking up. Her head was slightly bent forward. I felt every muscle in my body tense. Couldn't move, couldn't think straight. Toby was standing now, his ears back, growling softly. Then, for the first time, she lifted her head. Even from inside, I could see her face. Pale skin, hollow cheeks, eyes wide and unfocused. She wasn't looking at me exactly, more like through me, as if she didn't really see me at all. She stood there for a few seconds, then turned away and walked along the side of the cabin. I heard footsteps near the wall, then a faint scraping sound, like fingernails running along the wood. I sat frozen, waiting for it to stop. After a few minutes, it did. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting in the same spot, afraid to move. When morning came, I went outside carefully. The rain had stopped. I walked around the cabin, and that's when I saw it. On the wooden wall near the window, faint scratch marks. They weren't deep, but long, thin lines that trailed unevenly across the boards. I also found a small piece of fabric caught on the fence, light-colored, torn from something like a dress. I didn't touch it. That was enough for me. I packed everything, loaded my car, and drove out of there. On the way back, I stopped at a petrol station near Alnwick, and the man there asked if I'd been staying up near the old cabins by the woods. I said yes, and he nodded slowly. He told me that years ago, a woman had gone missing around that area. Someone who used to live near the forest and was known to wander barefoot sometimes after her husband left her. They never found her, only her belongings near the trees. I didn't say anything else. I just drove. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, when I think about those nights, I can still see her standing there in the rain, silent, still, her pale face half hidden in the dark. I don't know if she was real or if my mind, isolated and tired, made her up, but I know what I saw. I know the footprints were real, the scratches were real, and the feeling that someone had been watching me, that was real too. Sometimes, late at night, when I walk my dog near the fields outside my new home, I still look out toward the dark horizon, half expecting to see that thin figure standing still, just beyond the light, waiting. But I never do. Maybe she was lost and found her way back. Or maybe she's still wandering somewhere in those woods, standing quiet in the rain, looking for the next cabin with its lights still on. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to spend a weekend alone at an old hunting cabin in northern Montana. The place belonged to a friend of my uncle, who said I could use it anytime I wanted. I had been dealing with a lot at work and just needed quiet. No traffic, no phone calls, no people, just space to breathe. The cabin was deep in the woods, about 8 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by endless pine and birch. The last stretch of road was more like a trail, uneven and muddy, and by the time I got there, the sun was already starting to sink behind the mountains. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was small, built from dark, weathered wood, with a tin roof that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There was a small porch, a single window in the front, and an old metal chimney sticking out from the top. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and the only furniture was a single bed frame with a thin mattress, a wood stove, and a rickety table with a couple of mismatched chairs. There was no power, no signal, and no running water, just a hand pump outside that still worked if you were patient enough. I unpacked my gear slowly, trying to make the place feel like it was mine for the weekend. I set my rifle against the wall near the door, hung my jacket on a nail, and lit the lantern I brought with me. The yellow light made the place feel a little less empty, but the quiet was so deep that every small sound felt sharp, like the click of the lantern glass or the groan of the wood when I walked. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears. The plan was simple. I'd wake early, go out hunting for deer, come back before dark, and spend the evenings by the fire with some canned food and coffee. That first night went as expected. I made a small fire in the stove and cooked beans straight from the can. Outside, I could hear the wind picking up through the trees, brushing against the cabin walls and roof. Every now and then, I'd hear something faint in the distance. A branch snapping, maybe, or the cry of some animal, but nothing that felt strange. The woods are alive at night. That much I already knew. I went to sleep around 10. The bed was stiff, and I had to keep my jacket over me because the temperature dropped hard after sunset. I must have drifted off around midnight, but I woke up to a noise outside. It was faint, just a crunch of leaves and the sound of something dragging lightly against the ground. I lay still, listening. I thought maybe it was a deer, or maybe even a bear moving through the area. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, but I didn't get up. The noise stopped after a few seconds, and I stayed there for a while, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for it to start again. Didn't. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke before dawn and stepped outside with my coffee. The air was cold enough to see my breath, and the ground was covered with a thin layer of frost. I checked around the cabin out of curiosity and saw some marks in the dirt near the back. They looked like boot prints, but not mine. They were smaller and went off toward the woods. I figured maybe someone else had passed through before I got there. Maybe some local hiker or another hunter. I didn't think much of it. I spent most of that day out in the forest. I walked about 3 miles west, following a small stream that cut through the trees. The woods were quiet except for the occasional sound of a bird taking off or a branch snapping under my boots. Around noon, I found signs of deer tracks, but they looked a few days old. I sat near a clearing for a while, ate from a small pack of jerky, and then made my way back before it started getting dark. When I returned, something felt different. The first thing I noticed was the door. It was open just slightly, not wide, but enough for me to notice. I was sure I had shut it when I left. My stomach tightened as I stepped closer. Inside, everything looked almost the same except for one thing. My jacket, which I'd left hanging near the door, was now lying on the floor near the table. The lantern had been moved a few inches too, like someone had picked it up and put it back down. I checked my rifle. It was still there, leaning against the wall. I told myself maybe I just hadn't noticed the door when I left earlier, or maybe the wind had pushed it open. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I made sure to lock the door that night by sliding the small metal latch across it. I even put my cooler in front of the door just in case. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside kept me on edge. The wind, the branches tapping the roof, the faint creaks in the wood. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it wasn't faint. It was the slow crunch of footsteps circling the cabin. They were light, but steady, like someone trying not to be heard. I held my breath, staring toward the window. The footsteps stopped right outside the wall where my bed was. Then, for a moment, it was completely silent. I reached slowly for my flashlight and turned it on. pointing it toward the door. The beam of light caught the dust floating in the air. Nothing moved. I sat up and waited, barely breathing. Then came another sound, soft scraping, like fingers brushing against the wood siding near the window. I froze. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it. I wanted to yell or make noise, but I couldn't bring myself to. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. I stayed sitting up for nearly an hour, flashlight in hand, before I finally drifted off again out of exhaustion. When I woke up that morning, the first thing I did was go outside to check. The ground around the cabin was covered with a thin layer of mud from the night's frost melting. There were tracks, clear footprints. They weren't animal prints. They were human, barefoot, and small. The prints circled the cabin, stopping by the window and door, just like I'd heard during the night. My throat felt dry when I saw them. I looked out toward the trees but saw nothing. I packed up my things quickly, deciding I'd leave that afternoon instead of staying another night. But before I could, I needed to make one last trip down to the stream to fill my water jug. It was about a 10-minute walk from the cabin. The woods were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. Every time I turned around, the trees looked like they were hiding something between them. I moved faster than usual, filled my jug, and headed straight back. When I got back to the clearing, I saw something that made me stop cold. The cabin door was open again. Not just cracked, fully open. The cooler I'd left in front of it was pushed aside. I could see the inside from where I stood, and for a second, I swore I saw movement inside. I didn't go closer right away. I waited, standing completely still, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I saw what it was. Someone's arm pulling back from the window, disappearing inside. That was it for me. I didn't try to go in. I didn't even try to see who it was. I backed up slowly, then turned and walked as fast as I could toward the truck. Every instinct I had screamed to not look back, but I did once, just once. And I saw the faint shape of someone standing in the doorway, small, pale, watching me. I don't know if it was a man or a woman. I just knew I wasn't supposed to be there anymore. I drove out of those woods as fast as the trail would let me. By the time I hit the paved road, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't stop until I was back in town. When I told the owner later, he said that cabin had been empty for years, and no one ever stayed there long. A few hunters had complained of missing food or hearing things at night, but no one ever saw anyone. He thought maybe someone had been living out there secretly, maybe a squatter or someone who didn't want to be found. I didn't go back to check. I left the keys with him and told him to keep them. I've been in the woods plenty since then, but I never went near that part of Montana again. Every time I camp now, I still make sure the door's locked tight, and I never ignore footprints around where I sleep. It had been nearly 6 years since I'd last driven down that road. I never thought I'd see it again. The narrow gravel path cutting through the woods, the trees closing in on both sides like they were trying to swallow it whole. The cabin my ex-husband built sat somewhere at the end of it, near a small lake that barely showed up on maps. Back then, we used to go there to get away from everything. No phones, no noise, no people. Just us and the sound of the woods breathing. Now, I was going back there alone. It was late October 2017. I was 38, working too many hours, and I had this restless need that wouldn't leave me alone. My ex-husband, Mark, had passed away the previous winter. Heart attack, the kind that hits fast and doesn't wait for help. He was only 42. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the divorce. When his sister called to tell me, I didn't cry. I just sat there holding my phone, thinking about that cabin. It was the only place we ever truly got along. After a few months, I started thinking about the cabin more and more. It wasn't logic, it was something else. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I wanted to see what time had done to that place. Mark had bought it after the divorce, fixed it up even more, made it his permanent home. I didn't know if anyone had been there since he died. His sister said the property went back to the state, that it was abandoned now. That was enough reason for me. I left the city before dawn, driving north through endless stretches of farmland and forest. The sky was gray and heavy, the kind that promised rain but didn't deliver it yet. The air was colder than I expected, and the heater in my car barely kept up. I'd packed a small duffel bag, some food, a flashlight, and a folding knife. I wasn't planning on staying long, just a few hours, maybe one night if it didn't feel too strange. By the time I turned onto that narrow gravel road, the day was already fading. The last hour of sunlight bled through the trees in dull orange strips. The road was worse than I remembered. Potholes, loose stones, weeds creeping into the center. I slowed down and kept both hands on the wheel, feeling every jolt. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than it used to. The roof sagged a little on one side, and the porch steps were half rotted. The windows were dusty but not broken. The door was still the same dark green Mark had painted it years ago. Part of me thought I should just turn around and leave, but I didn't. I parked near the edge of the clearing and sat for a moment, listening. The woods were silent except for the faint drip of water somewhere and the rustle of dry leaves. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. When I opened the car door, the cold hit me hard. I could hear my own footsteps crunching on the gravel as I walked toward the porch. The front door was unlocked. Inside, it was darker than I expected, even though it wasn't fully night yet. Dust floated through the light coming from the small windows. The air smelled stale, like old wood and mildew. The living room was almost the same as I remembered. The same heavy oak table, the same small wood stove in the corner. The couch was covered with a thin sheet that had turned gray from dust. A few old beer bottles sat on the counter. Everything felt untouched, like time had paused here when he died. I walked around slowly, my shoes making soft creaks on the wooden floor. There were papers scattered on the table, receipts, notes, a small notebook. Most of it was damp and unreadable. I noticed something else, too. Scratches along the floorboards near the door, long and uneven. Probably an animal that got in at some point, I thought. The back of the cabin was worse. The bathroom mirror was cracked, the sink stained with rust. The bedroom still had his old bed frame, no mattress, just the bare wooden slats. A few shirts hung from nails on the wall. Everything smelled like rot and wet fabric. I remember standing there for a long time, staring at that empty bed frame. It was strange how a place could hold memories without holding warmth. As the sun went down, the cabin grew colder. I decided to stay just one night, mostly because I didn't want to drive those narrow roads in the dark. I set up my sleeping bag near the stove and tried to get a fire going. The wood was damp, and it took me nearly half an hour before the fire caught. The warmth made the place feel slightly less dead, though the shadows on the walls looked sharper. After eating a sandwich from my bag, I stepped outside. The woods were silent again. No wind, no insects, nothing. The lake was visible through the trees, still and black. I remembered how Mark used to sit there for hours fishing. The reflection of the moon trembled on the water. When I turned back toward the cabin, I saw a faint light flicker inside, just for a second, like someone had walked past the fire. I froze, then told myself it was just the fire shifting. But when I stepped inside again, the fire had burned low, steady, and nothing looked different. Still, something about the air felt wrong, like the whole place was holding its breath. I tried to sleep, but every sound pulled me awake. The creaks in the floor, the soft patter of water dripping from the roof. At some point, I heard a dull thump from the back of the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. It came again, slow and heavy, like something hitting the wall. I grabbed the flashlight and my knife and forced myself to check. The sound led me to the small storage room near the back door. The light beam cut through the darkness, showing boxes, tools, and a rusted metal cabinet. The noise stopped. I waited. Then, faintly, I heard something move, something brushing against the wall outside. I opened the back door, and the cold air rushed in. The ground was wet, the soil soft from earlier drizzle. I scanned the edge of the woods. The beam caught footprints, faint, uneven ones leading from the trees to the wall and back again. They were human, but not steady, like whoever made them was limping or dragging something. I stayed there for a long minute, staring into the woods, but saw nothing. I locked the door and pushed one of the heavy chairs against it. After that, I didn't sleep much. Every sound kept me awake until the first light crept through the windows. When morning came, I went outside again. The footprints were clearer now, fresh, deep in the mud. They came from the tree line, stopped right by the window near where I slept, then turned away. My stomach twisted when I saw that the glass had a faint smudge on it, like someone had pressed their face there to look inside. I followed the trail into the woods for a few yards before I stopped. There was no reason to keep going. Whoever it was, they were gone now. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone passing through. But the prints weren't from boots. They looked like bare feet, wide and rough, the toes spread apart like someone who'd been walking barefoot for a long time. I packed up fast after that. Before leaving, I took one last look at the cabin. The light hit it through the trees, and for a second, it looked peaceful again, like it used to. But I knew I'd never come back. On the drive out, I kept checking my rearview mirror. The road twisted behind me, fading into the trees. When I reached the highway, I finally breathed easier. A week later, I called Mark's sister and told her about the footprints, about how the place looked abandoned but not entirely empty. She told me the police had found evidence months ago that someone had been squatting there after Mark died. Someone living in the woods, using the cabin when it got too cold. They never caught him. I didn't tell her about the smudge on the window. I sold my car 2 months later and moved closer to the city. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I think about that cabin, how quiet it was, how it felt like the woods were listening. I think about those barefoot prints and wonder how long that person had been there before I arrived. And sometimes, I wonder if they were there that whole night, standing just outside the window, watching me through the glass while I slept beside the dying fire. It was the summer of 2012 when I took a job as a seasonal park ranger in northern Montana, near a stretch of land called Flat Creek Reserve. It was one of those places that looked peaceful from a distance. Dense pine trees, a cold stream cutting through the valley, and mountains that disappeared into low-hanging clouds. But once you stayed there long enough, it began to feel too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you start hearing things that might not even be there. I was 29 at the time, and I took the job mainly to get away from city noise and people. I thought the isolation would clear my head. I didn't realize how much being alone could get inside your mind. My station was a small log cabin built back in the late 60s, sitting about 8 miles from the nearest paved road. It had a radio, a metal cot, a propane stove, and an old map nailed to the wall that showed trails and ranger posts that weren't even used anymore. The wood creaked with every step, and the screen door never fully closed unless I hooked it from the inside. The roof leaked in one corner when it rained, and sometimes I'd find claw marks on the porch rail from raccoons or maybe a bear. I didn't mind it though. It was simple, quiet living. My job was to patrol the trails, keep track of animal sightings, and make sure campers stayed within the allowed areas. Most days were uneventful. I'd wake up at dawn, brew black coffee that tasted like burnt dirt, check the perimeter, and walk a few miles along the tree line. I carried a notebook to record things, tracks, fallen trees, weather changes. I liked it that way, routine, predictable. But one week in late August, things started feeling different. It began with a report from another ranger station down south about some missing camping equipment, axes, rope, and a tent. They figured it was just a hiker who took off without checking out. That kind of thing happens sometimes. But a few days later, I found something similar near the North Ridge. A torn sleeping bag, ripped open like someone had dragged it across the rocks. No blood, no footprints, nothing. Just shredded nylon. The next morning, while walking the trail near the creek, I noticed cigarette butts on the ground. Fresh ones. The problem was no one was supposed to smoke in the reserve, and I hadn't seen another ranger or hiker in days. The cigarettes were lined up near a cluster of trees, almost like someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. I picked one up with a stick. It was still slightly warm. I remember standing there, scanning the woods, hearing only the wind and water moving over the rocks. That night, I couldn't sleep. The woods outside seemed louder than usual. Crickets, owls, something shifting in the brush now and then. I tried reading by lantern light, but the creaking of the cabin pulled my attention every few minutes. At around 2 a.m., I heard a thud from outside, something heavy hitting the porch. My heart started racing immediately. I grabbed my flashlight and unhooked the door slowly. When I stepped out, the beam of light cut through the fog that had settled around the trees. There was nothing on the porch except a wet boot print near the steps. It wasn't mine. The next morning, I checked the perimeter again. I walked about half a mile down the dirt path and found something else. A small fire pit, recently put out. The ashes were still warm. There were animal bones scattered around it, stripped clean. Some of the larger ones looked like deer, but others were smaller, thinner, almost like dog bones. There were no tents, no gear, no signs of anyone sleeping nearby. Just the fire pit and the bones. I buried what I could under dirt and rocks. Over the next few days, I started finding other things. An empty can of beans, a torn flannel shirt stuck on a tree branch, a rusted pocket knife jammed into the dirt by the creek. It all pointed to someone camping illegally, someone who knew how to stay hidden. I started logging everything, writing the exact times and locations, but each day it felt like whoever was out there was moving closer. On the fourth night, the noises outside changed. No more distant movement. It was closer, snapping twigs, slow footsteps around the cabin. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, holding the flashlight like a weapon. My breathing felt too loud. I heard the crunch of gravel near the back wall, right where the storage shed was. I waited, not moving, just listening. After what felt like forever, the sound faded away. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I hiked toward the southern ridge to see if I could spot anything from higher ground. The air was dry, and the sun burned through the haze. When I reached the top, I could see the valley stretch out below, the stream, the dirt trails, and my cabin in the distance. Something caught my eye near the treeline. It was a shape, maybe a person, standing half in shadow. They were facing my cabin. I tried to use my binoculars, but the figure stepped back into the trees before I could focus. By the time I made it back, it was almost dark. The air smelled like smoke. I sprinted the last 100 yards, and when I reached the cabin, I saw that someone had been there. The front door was open. My food supplies were scattered on the floor, cans rolled under the table, and the radio was turned on but full of static. I checked every corner, every inch of that cabin, but there was no one inside. My shotgun was still under the cot, untouched, but the small lockbox where I kept my personal stuff, wallet, notebook, ID was gone. That was the moment when I realized this wasn't random anymore. Someone was watching me, maybe testing how long I'd stay alone before leaving. I spent that night locked inside, shotgun in hand, every window covered with whatever I could find. I didn't even light the lantern. I just sat there in the dark, staring at the door, counting every second that passed. I kept thinking about those cigarette butts, the boot print, the bones by the creek. It all made sense now. Whoever was out there had probably been living in these woods for a while, maybe off the grid, maybe running from something. And now I was in their space. At sunrise, I packed what I could into my bag: radio, first aid kit, water, the shotgun, and decided to head for the main ranger station, about 10 miles south. I didn't even look back at the cabin. The forest felt different that morning. The air was still, too still, and every sound felt sharper. About halfway through the hike, I saw something hanging from a tree branch. When I got closer, I realized it was my lockbox, the one that had been stolen. It was tied up with rope, swinging gently in the wind. Inside was my wallet, but the ID card was missing. Everything else was there. That was enough for me. I didn't stop moving until I reached the station around noon. I reported everything. Every sound, every object I'd found, every detail I could remember. They sent a search team out that evening, but they didn't find anyone. Just the same campfire remains, the same bones, and the same empty silence. I never went back to that cabin after that. The Park Service reassigned me to another post closer to the town border, but sometimes at night, I still think about that place. The way the woods surrounded it like a wall. The feeling of being watched even when I couldn't see anyone. A few months later, I got a call from one of the senior rangers. They'd found another illegal campsite deeper in the forest, about 2 miles from where my cabin stood. There were signs someone had been living there for a long time. Handmade traps, canned food, animal hides hanging from branches. But whoever it was, they were gone. The only thing left behind was a small notebook, soaked and half-torn, with pages full of maps and notes about ranger patrol times, supply drops, and cabin locations. My cabin was marked on almost every page. After that, I stopped taking field posts. I still work with the parks, but from an office now, miles away from the woods. People sometimes ask me why I don't go back out there. I just tell them I've had enough of the quiet, because sometimes when it gets too quiet, it's not peace you're feeling. It's someone waiting, watching from the dark, just far enough away that you'll never see them until it's too late. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a week off work and get away from everything. I was 34 at the time, living in Chicago, working long hours at an auto repair shop, and I felt like I hadn't breathed properly in years. A friend from high school, who I hadn't spoken to in a while, had told me months earlier about an old cabin his uncle once owned somewhere in northern Wisconsin. He said it had been abandoned for a long time, sitting on a patch of forest land near a small lake, and that no one really went there anymore. I wasn't looking for luxury, just silence. So I packed up my truck with enough food, water, and tools to last a week and drove north. The drive took about 7 hours. Once I left the main highway, the road narrowed to a cracked 2-lane stretch surrounded by trees that pressed in closer with every mile. I passed only one small gas station, the kind that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. I filled up the tank, bought a few cans of soup and a map, and kept going. The last few miles were nothing but gravel and dirt, leading deeper into forest so thick that the sunlight only came through in broken strips. My tires kicked up dust that hung in the air behind me like a brown fog. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin sat just where the map said it would be, about 200 yards off the road, half hidden behind tall pines and overgrown brush. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and one of the shutters was missing. The wood siding was gray from years of weather, but the structure itself looked solid. There was a small wooden dock by the lake, maybe 30 feet out into the water, though it leaned a little to the right. Everything smelled like pine needles, wet dirt, and old wood. I remember feeling a strange mix of calm and alertness, the kind that comes from being completely alone in the middle of nowhere. I unloaded my things, swept out the inside, and found a corner to roll out my sleeping bag. There was one small bed frame in the back room, but the mattress was so musty and torn I didn't want to use it. The place had an old stove, a table, and a single oil lamp that I found half full on a shelf. The first night, I lit a fire in the small stone fireplace, ate a can of beans, and sat listening to the forest outside. There were the usual sounds: crickets, frogs, the wind through the trees, but every so often there was something else. Something that didn't fit the pattern. A quick rustle in the brush, or a distant cracking sound like a branch snapping under weight. I told myself it was probably a deer. There were plenty of them around. The next morning, I went down to the lake with my coffee and watched the mist lift off the surface. It was beautiful, silent, and still. I thought about how different this was from the constant hum of traffic and people talking in the city. Around midday, I started cleaning around the property. Behind the cabin, half buried under vines, I found what looked like an old shed. The door was stuck, but I pried it open with a crowbar and found the inside filled with rusted tools, fishing gear, and a few empty fuel cans. I didn't think much of it until I noticed something odd. A rope tied to one of the beams in the corner, hanging down like it had once held something heavy. It wasn't new. The rope was old, frayed, and dry, like it had been there for years. That night it rained. The kind of rain that starts slow and then comes down in sheets. I stayed inside, writing in a small notebook and trying to read by flashlight. Around midnight, I started hearing noises again. Heavier this time. Not the small, quick kind like an animal. These were spaced apart, slow and deliberate like steps on the porch. I sat still for a few minutes, listening hard. The rain made it hard to be sure. Then, after a while, it stopped. No more sound except for the wind and water against the roof. I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably nothing. Maybe a raccoon or something that got close for shelter. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was soaked, muddy, and scattered with pine needles. There were prints near the steps, bare footprints, large ones. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining things, that the rain had shaped puddles weirdly. But as I looked closer, I saw the clear outline of toes and the curve of a heel. Someone had been there, someone barefoot. The prints went around the cabin, disappearing into the trees. That shook me a little. I wasn't scared yet, but I felt uneasy. I had brought a small revolver with me, something I kept locked in a case in the truck. I loaded it that morning and kept it close for the rest of the day. I didn't see anyone around, not even from the distance of the road. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had walked around the cabin in the night. By the fourth day, I hadn't slept well in 2 nights. I'd keep waking up to faint noises outside, always around the same time, between midnight and 3. Once, I thought I heard something dragging across the dirt, slow and steady. When I looked out the window, I couldn't see anything, just trees shifting in the wind. But the smell had changed too. The air near the cabin had a faint sourness to it, like something rotting nearby. I walked around the property again that morning and found a half-dug patch of earth about 30 feet behind the shed. The dirt looked fresh. Someone had turned it recently, though not completely covered it again. My stomach tightened as I crouched down. I didn't want to dig, but I couldn't stop myself. Under about 6 inches of dirt, I hit something hard. At first, I thought it was a rock, but when I cleared more away, I saw it was wood. A small wooden box, old and water-stained. My hands shook as I lifted it out. The lid wasn't nailed shut. It just stuck from dampness. Inside were a few things: an old hunting knife, a rusted lighter, and what looked like a wallet wrapped in a piece of cloth. I opened it carefully. The ID inside was nearly faded out, but I could still read the name. It wasn't anyone I knew. The address was from a nearby town I'd passed on the drive up. The expiration date on the license was from 1984. I sat there for a while, staring at it. I didn't know what to do. Someone had buried this here. Someone who might still come back. That night, I barely slept at all. I kept the gun close, and every sound outside made my heart hammer. Just before dawn, I heard it again. The same dragging noise, but this time it was closer, right outside the wall near my bed. The sound of something or someone moving slowly around the cabin. I froze, barely breathing, until it stopped. Then silence. When the sun came up, I went outside. The footprints were back. More of them this time. And beside the door, something was left on the ground. The same wallet I'd found buried in the dirt. Only now it was clean, as if someone had wiped the mud off. I don't remember thinking after that. I just grabbed my things, threw them into the truck, and started driving. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station nearly 50 miles away. I told the clerk that someone had been on my property, that I thought someone was living out there. He gave me the number for the county sheriff, and I called it in. A few days later, an officer called back. They'd gone out there, checked the cabin and the area. He said they found evidence of someone camping in the woods nearby. A small lean-to shelter, a burned-out fire, a pile of clothes and trash. He said it looked like someone had been living rough out there for years. When I asked if they found the wallet or the box, he said no, nothing like that. I never went back. I sold the truck a year later, threw away the notebook, and tried to forget the whole trip. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see those footprints in the mud. Bare feet, big enough to belong to a grown man, circling the cabin in the rain. And I still wonder who he was, or maybe how long he'd been there before I came. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to spend a few days alone in a small cabin I had bought a few months earlier. It was deep in the northern woods of Montana, about 40 miles from the nearest town. I had bought the place cheap from a man who said he was done with the quiet. It sat beside a narrow dirt road that twisted up through the trees for miles. The cabin wasn't much, just a single room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a bed built into the wall. But it was mine, and I wanted to fix it up before the snow came. The first day went smooth. I arrived around noon, parked my truck beside the cabin, and started unloading tools and supplies. The air was cold enough to see my breath, and the trees had lost most of their leaves. There was no signal that far out, no noise except the steady sound of the wind in the pines. It felt good at first, quiet in a way you can't get anywhere else. I spent the afternoon patching a leak in the roof and stacking firewood I had brought from town. When the sun went down, the forest got dark fast. The kind of dark that eats the light from your flashlight the moment it leaves your hand. Inside, I lit a few candles and started a fire. The wood crackled in the stove, and the orange glow made the cabin look warmer than it really was. I ate a can of beans, sat for a while, and then crawled into bed. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, and how I wished I could just stay there longer. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping noise outside the wall near my head. At first I thought it was a branch or maybe an animal, but it wasn't moving like that. It was slow, steady, like metal dragging across wood. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again. I lay there listening, trying not to move. The sound stopped after a while, and I eventually fell back asleep, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or something digging around. The next morning, I went outside to check. I walked around to the back wall and saw marks on the wood. Thin, deep scratches that ran along the boards. Not like an animal claw, more like something made with a knife or a nail. They were about chest height, long and uneven. I ran my hand over them and felt the rough edges. It bothered me, but I tried not to overthink it. There were old hunters' shacks scattered in those woods, and sometimes people wandered through. Maybe someone was curious, or drunk, or lost. I didn't like the idea, but it was possible. I worked most of the day cutting wood and cleaning inside. Still, every time I stepped outside, I found myself looking toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone there. By sunset, the wind had picked up, and I could hear it whistling through the cracks in the roof. The temperature dropped fast, so I went inside and built a stronger fire. As I sat there, I noticed how loud the forest got when the wind blew. The trees groaned and creaked, and sometimes it sounded like footsteps crunching in the leaves. I told myself it was just the wind, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, I woke up again. The fire had burned low, and the room was cold. That same scraping sound started up outside, only this time it was closer to the window. Slow, dragging, deliberate. Then I heard another sound, something light, like a footstep in the dirt. I froze, barely breathing. The noise went on for a few minutes, circling the cabin. Then everything went quiet again. I stayed awake until morning, gripping my flashlight, waiting for the light to come through the window. When it finally did, I went outside and checked the ground. There were footprints in the dirt behind the cabin, boot prints. Not mine. They led from the tree line to the wall, then back into the woods. The soil was soft enough to see the shape clearly, and they looked fresh. That was the moment I started to feel real fear. Not the kind you can explain away with logic. The kind that sticks in your stomach. Someone had been outside that night. I locked the truck doors and thought about leaving, but I had a lot of my gear there, and the nearest town was hours away. I told myself maybe it was a hunter or a local messing around. That day, I didn't do much work. I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see movement. Around noon, I heard something faint in the distance, like wood snapping, followed by silence. It came from the direction of the small clearing down the hill. I walked out a little way, then stopped. It was too quiet. Even the wind had died down. I turned back and went inside, bolting the door behind me. As it got dark, I made sure the fire was strong and kept my flashlight beside me. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound outside felt like it was aimed at me. Sometime near dawn, I heard it again. The slow scrape on the wall, this time right beside the door. Then a short thud, like someone bumping against it. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The noise stopped, but I didn't move until it got light. When I finally opened the door, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The scratches on the wood were deeper, more deliberate, and right beside them, something new. Small shavings of wood scattered on the ground, as if someone had been trying to pry something loose. The footprints were back too, circling around the cabin. I knew then I had to leave. I packed everything I could fit in the truck and threw the rest inside. When I got in, I saw something through the windshield, a dark shape between the trees at the edge of the clearing. Too far to make out clearly, but tall, still, and facing my direction. I didn't wait. I started the truck and drove down the road fast, gravel kicking up behind me. The drive out felt longer than it should have. Every turn looked the same, every tree like it was hiding something behind it. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Only then did I pull over and breathe for a moment. I looked back once, and the road behind me was just empty forest again, silent and ordinary. When I got to town, I called the county sheriff. I didn't have much to tell them except that someone had been at the cabin. They sent a deputy to check it out a day later. He said there were signs someone had been there, footprints, marks on the wall, but nothing else. No sign of forced entry, no damage inside. Just those long scratches and some broken branches near the edge of the woods. I never went back after that. I sold the cabin a few months later. The new owner told me he was planning to turn it into a hunting lodge. He asked if there was anything he should know about it, and I just said it needed a new lock on the door and a good roof. Sometimes I still think about those nights. The sound of the scraping, the quiet steps in the dirt, the figure in the trees. I know it wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, maybe just curious, or maybe worse. I'll never know what they wanted, but I know I left just in time. Now, whenever I drive through that part of Montana, I stay on the main road. I keep the windows up and don't look toward the woods. The silence out there used to feel peaceful. Now it just feels like it's listening. It was the fall of 2019 when I decided to take a week off and drive out to a small cabin I had once rented years ago, deep in the northern woods of Montana. I needed to clear my head after everything that had been going on. Work stress, noisy neighbors, and just the general feeling of being stuck. I brought my dog, Baxter, a 4-year-old German Shepherd who hated city noise but loved the woods. He was quiet, alert, and always seemed to sense things before I did. I figured we both needed some time away. The drive took almost 8 hours from my apartment in Missoula. The last 40 miles were nothing but narrow, cracked roads twisting between trees that looked more like walls than forest. The cabin sat near a small lake, or more like a wide pond, with murky green water and a wooden dock half sunk at one end. The cabin was small, just one room with a bed, a stove, and a little porch that faced the water. It looked older than I remembered, more weather-beaten, like it had aged a decade since the last time I was there. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. The nearest town was almost an hour away, and there was no cell service. That didn't bother me much. I stocked up before leaving: canned food, water, flashlight batteries, a small generator, and a first aid kit. I had enough supplies to last the week without a problem. The first day went peacefully. Baxter stayed close to me as I unpacked and got the generator running. By late afternoon, I sat on the porch watching the lake, drinking coffee, while Baxter lay near my feet, half asleep but occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air. Everything felt calm, almost too calm, in a way that made me aware of every little sound: the water slapping softly against the dock, the wind brushing through dry leaves, and the occasional caw of crows somewhere in the distance. That night, I built a small fire pit near the porch. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun went down. Baxter stayed near me, but every few minutes he'd lift his head sharply and stare out toward the tree line behind the cabin. His ears would stand straight, and he'd make this low, rumbling growl deep in his chest. I couldn't see anything, not even movement, just dark shapes of trees merging into one another. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Still, it made my skin crawl a little. When I went inside for the night, I made sure to lock the door. The cabin had one small window next to the bed, and I pulled the curtain shut tight. The sound of the wind outside was steady, almost like a faint hum. Baxter lay near the door, but he didn't sleep right away. I could tell. He kept adjusting, standing up and lying back down, sniffing the air like he was unsure about something. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound that was hard to describe. It was like something soft brushing against wood, a slow dragging sound. Baxter was already standing, stiff, his body angled toward the window. I sat up, heart thumping, and listened. The sound came again, slower this time, like something sliding along the porch boards. I reached for the flashlight and turned it on, shining it toward the window. Nothing. No shadows, no shapes, just the curtain moving slightly because of the draft. I stayed awake for an hour after that, sitting up in bed, flashlight still on, until I finally dozed off again around dawn. The next morning, I went outside to check. The porch had marks on it, long scuff lines running across the boards, as if someone had dragged something heavy or metal. They weren't deep scratches, more like smudged dirt, but they hadn't been there before. I looked around for footprints or any sign of animals but found nothing. Just those faint marks leading toward the edge of the porch and stopping right at the stairs. I tried not to think too much about it. I spent the day hiking around the lake with Baxter, letting him run loose. The forest was quiet in a strange way. No people, no sounds of distant engines, just occasional bird calls and wind. By the time we got back to the cabin that evening, I felt tired but a little uneasy again. Baxter stayed close to me all day, more than usual. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing small cracks and rustles from the trees. I didn't want to build a fire because I thought it might draw attention. So I stayed inside with a lantern on the table, trying to read an old book I had brought. Baxter suddenly lifted his head and gave a deep, steady growl toward the window. He didn't bark, just stood there, hair raised along his back. My pulse jumped. I turned off the lantern and stood still, waiting. There was movement outside, faint, like someone stepping on dry leaves. Not constant, just one or two crunches, then silence. I stood near the window, careful not to make any noise. Then another sound, this time from the other side of the cabin. Slow steps, almost careful. My mind ran through what it could be. Maybe a bear, maybe someone lost. But who would be walking out there in pitch-black woods in the middle of the night? I stayed like that for almost an hour, barely moving, while Baxter stood watch by the door. When the sounds finally stopped, I checked the door lock again and didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I went around the cabin again. This time, I found something that made my stomach twist. About 20 feet from the porch, near the tree line, there was a piece of rope lying on the ground. It looked old and frayed, but one end was tied into a rough loop, like a handle or something someone might grip onto. The ground near it had disturbed dirt, like a small spot where someone had stood or knelt. No boot prints, though, just uneven patches of pressed soil. I packed my things that afternoon, planning to leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive those roads at night, but I also didn't feel comfortable staying another night either. I kept the generator off to make the place as quiet as possible. I didn't even cook dinner, just ate a granola bar and stayed near the window watching the dark come in. Around midnight, Baxter started growling again. It wasn't his usual warning growl. It was deeper, slower, like he was trying to tell me something wasn't right. I turned off my lantern and listened. The steps came again, but this time closer, circling the cabin slowly. I heard something brush against the wall. Maybe clothing, maybe a branch. Then a quiet metallic sound, like something scraping the doorknob. I stood up, holding the flashlight tight, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. I didn't open the door. I just waited. Baxter's growl grew louder, and he lunged toward the door, barking now, sharp and angry. The footsteps retreated fast, crunching through leaves and fading toward the trees. I stood there, frozen, until everything went silent again. By dawn, I was packed. I didn't even finish my coffee. I got in the truck, Baxter in the passenger seat, and drove off without looking back. About 2 miles down the dirt road, I stopped when I saw something strange. Tire marks, fresh ones, overlapping mine from when I'd arrived days earlier. They were wide, like from a pickup, and led straight up toward the cabin. Whoever had come there had driven up after me, maybe even the night before. I didn't stop again until I reached the highway. When I finally got home that evening, I sat on the floor with Baxter, just petting him while he leaned against me, still alert like he hadn't relaxed yet either. I never called the police because what would I even say? No one hurt me, nothing was stolen, but someone had been there watching, waiting for something I don't think I want to understand. I never went back to that cabin again. Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep and I hear Baxter growl faintly at the window, I wonder if the sound of those slow footsteps on the porch ever really stopped, or if they just followed us home. It was the autumn of 2016 when I decided to take a few days off work and drive out to the northern woods of Montana. I was 33 back then, tired of everything that came with city life. The noise, the rush, the constant feeling of being surrounded by people but still alone. I had this idea that some quiet time in nature would fix that. I rented a small, old cabin from a man I found online who said it used to belong to his grandfather. It was cheap, isolated, and had no cell service, which sounded perfect at the time. The listing said it was about a mile off a dirt road, with a view of the lake and plenty of trails around. That sounded peaceful enough for me. I left early on a Thursday morning. It took me almost 10 hours to get there from Spokane, including the long stretches of empty road where I didn't see another car for miles. The air grew colder as I went higher into the hills, and the leaves were deep red and gold, scattered like fire across the ground. When I finally found the turnoff for the dirt road, it looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wooden sign marking the turn was leaning sideways, covered in moss. The road was narrow and rough, and branches scraped against the sides of my old Jeep as I drove through. After about 15 minutes of crawling up that bumpy road, I saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by trees so tall they blocked most of the sky. The place looked older than I expected. The wood was dark and worn, and the roof sagged a little in the middle. There was an old metal chair on the porch and a stack of chopped wood that looked gray and damp. I remember thinking it had a strange feeling to it, quiet in a way that felt heavy, like the kind of silence that has been there for too long. I got out, stretched, and walked around the place. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine. My dog, Max, a brown lab mix, jumped out of the back seat and started sniffing around the porch. He seemed calm at first, but as soon as he reached the far corner of the cabin, he stopped and stared into the trees. His tail went down and he gave this low growl. I figured it was just a deer or something. I called him back, unloaded my stuff, and went inside. The cabin was simple. One room with a small kitchen area, an old wood stove, a table, a bed, and a bathroom at the back. The air inside was stale, and it smelled like dust and old wood. There was a single small window near the sink, and the curtains were stiff from years of not being washed. I swept the floor, wiped off the table, and unpacked a few things. After getting the fire going, I sat down with a beer, feeling the quiet settle in around me. That night it rained. The sound of it hitting the metal roof was loud, almost too loud. The wind moved through the trees, making this deep moaning sound that kept me half awake.
Max was restless.
He kept lifting his head, staring toward the door. Around midnight, I heard something outside, like a branch breaking, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the cabin. I sat up, listened, but didn't hear anything else. I told myself it was an animal and eventually fell asleep again. The next morning was foggy and cold. The rain had turned the dirt outside into thick mud. I decided to walk down to the lake before breakfast. Max ran ahead, following the path that led downhill. It took about 15 minutes to reach the water. The lake was calm and flat, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. I threw a stick for Max, watched him swim a while, then started heading back. On the way up, Max suddenly stopped and started barking toward a pile of fallen branches just off the trail. I walked over, thinking maybe he'd found a squirrel or raccoon. But when I pushed some of the branches aside, I saw fabric, a piece of dark green cloth buried under leaves. For a moment, I thought it was trash, maybe someone's old camping gear. But when I pulled another branch away, I saw something pale underneath. My stomach went cold. It took me a few seconds to realize what I was looking at. It was a human arm. The skin was grayish, the fingers curled slightly, dirt packed under the nails. I stepped back so fast I almost tripped. My chest felt tight, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I didn't touch anything else. I just stood there staring, trying to convince myself I was wrong, that it wasn't what it looked like. But the smell hit me next, a sweet, rotten odor that made my stomach turn. There was no mistaking it. I turned around and went straight back to the cabin. My hands were shaking. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. I tried walking up the road for a bit, thinking maybe I'd get a bar or two, but it was useless. I couldn't call anyone. My only option was to drive down to town and tell the police. But the thought of leaving that place with something like that in the woods didn't sit right. I didn't want to drive alone, not until I knew what was going on. I kept thinking, what if whoever did that was still around? I decided to stay until morning. The idea was to pack up early and leave as soon as the sun came up. I tried to eat, but I couldn't. Max kept pacing near the door, whining now and then. The woods, which had felt peaceful a day ago, now felt like they were watching me. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Around evening, I went out to get more wood, but the axe that had been leaning by the porch was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty spot, my mind racing. I couldn't remember if I had moved it, but I was sure I hadn't. I went back inside and locked the door with the old rusty latch. That night was worse than the last. The wind had stopped, but I could hear something faint outside now and then. Soft steps in the dirt, too heavy to be an animal. Max growled low every few minutes, staring at the door. Around 2 a.m., I heard something slide across the porch, then a thud, then silence. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping a flashlight, my back pressed against the wall. I stayed that way until the first light of morning came through the window. When I finally stepped outside, there were fresh footprints in the mud near the porch. Barefoot, small, but deep enough to tell someone had been there. I didn't think twice. I threw my stuff into the Jeep, called Max, and started driving down the dirt road as fast as I could without getting stuck. It took almost 40 minutes to reach the nearest small town. I found the sheriff's office, told them everything. They sent a few deputies back up with me. When we got there, the fog had lifted. The area near the lake was taped off. They found the body easily. It hadn't been buried deep. From what I heard later, it had been there for months, maybe even a year. A man in his 40s who had been reported missing from another county. They said his cause of death looked like blunt force trauma. Whoever had done it knew the area well enough to hide him where no one would find him. The sheriff asked about the footprints, the missing axe, and I told him everything I remembered. They didn't find the axe. They didn't find any other tracks either. But they said the body had been covered recently, like someone had been back to check on it. I never went back after that. The cabin was taken apart months later, I heard. The land was bought by someone else. But sometimes I still think about that night. The footsteps on the porch, the missing axe, the way Max stared into the trees that first day. Whoever had been there must have known I found the body. Maybe they were watching me the whole time, waiting for me to leave, just like I was waiting for daylight to come. And even now, when I drive through quiet wooded roads, I still get that same tight feeling in my chest. The woods don't scare me because of what's in them. They scare me because of who might be. It was late October, somewhere outside a small town called Morley, in northern Michigan. I had taken a few days off work and decided to drive up to a property my uncle left me years ago. An old wooden cabin that sat behind a small graveyard. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was built in the 1950s, with warped wood, broken shutters, and a metal roof that rattled when the wind blew. The graveyard beside it was small. Maybe 20 or 30 headstones, most of them tilted and worn down, surrounded by a rusty iron fence that barely stood anymore. I'd never stayed there before, but I thought it would be quiet, maybe peaceful, just a place to clear my head. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, the kind that make everything look dull and washed out. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine needles. I parked the truck near the old gate and stepped out. The first thing that hit me was how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just the faint creak of trees swaying. The ground was damp from rain the night before, and every step made a soft squishing sound. The cabin stood about 30 yards from the edge of the graveyard, partly hidden behind overgrown bushes and tall grass that reached almost to my knees. I had to push the door open hard. The frame had swollen from moisture, and the hinges groaned like something alive. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old wood. There were cobwebs in the corners, and a thin film of dirt covered everything. The single small window let in just enough light to see the outlines of old furniture. A table, 2 chairs, and a small iron stove in the corner. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and I remember thinking that it was going to take a lot of work to make this place even halfway livable. But it had a strange pull to it, the kind of silence that makes you feel watched, even when you know you're alone. I spent the first hour cleaning, sweeping dirt into a pile, wiping the dust off the table, setting up my sleeping bag in the corner. There was no electricity, but I'd brought a lantern and a few candles. Outside, the sun was already starting to sink behind the trees. The light coming through the window turned orange, and shadows began to stretch across the room. I walked out to the truck to grab my cooler and gear, and that's when I noticed something odd. Near the graveyard gate, the tall grass was flattened, like someone had walked through it recently. The ground there was darker too, maybe from rain, but it looked more like it had been disturbed. I tried not to think too much about it. Probably just deer, I told myself, and went back inside. By nightfall, the air had turned cold. I lit the lantern, its yellow light flickering across the walls. The sound of crickets finally started up, but it was faint, uneven, like they were scattered far away. I sat at the table eating canned soup, listening to the occasional crack of wood expanding as the cabin cooled. At some point, I noticed the smell. Faint at first, like damp soil mixed with something sour. I thought it might be the stove, so I checked it, but it was empty. Then I realized it was coming from outside, seeping through the cracks in the wood. It wasn't strong, but enough to make my stomach turn a little. I opened the door to let in some air. The yard was pitch black, except for the faint light from my lantern spilling onto the ground. The graveyard fence stood like a jagged line in the dark. The smell got stronger when the door opened, thicker. It reminded me of something rotting, not like garbage, more like a dead animal buried shallow under wet earth. I scanned the edge of the graveyard but couldn't see much. My flashlight caught only the tops of gravestones glinting faintly. The wind started to pick up, carrying that smell right toward the cabin. I shut the door and went back to my corner, telling myself again it was just something dead out there. Maybe a raccoon or something that wandered too close. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something faint. Not loud, but just enough to keep my mind awake. It was a sound like dragging or scratching somewhere outside the walls. Sometimes it stopped for minutes, then started again. I told myself it was branches scraping the siding, but the sound was too deliberate, too slow. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing now and then like someone circling. Around midnight, I sat up and turned the lantern up brighter. The light filled the room with a warm glow, but it only made the shadows sharper. The sound stopped completely after that. I sat there, staring at the window, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. After maybe an hour, I finally laid back down, still half awake. When I opened my eyes again, the lantern was out. The first thing I noticed was that the smell had crept back inside, stronger than before. The second thing was that the air felt colder, heavier, like when you walk into a basement that's been shut up for too long. I got up, found my flashlight, and looked around. Everything inside looked the same, but the front door, the one I had latched shut before going to bed, was slightly open, just an inch or two, enough to see a thin line of fog outside. I froze for a few seconds, staring at it. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything move. My first thought was that the wind must have blown it open. even though I knew that latch had been tight. I stepped forward and pushed it closed, sliding the latch back into place. The smell hit harder as I did. I could almost taste it, earthy, sour, like wet decay. I decided right then I wasn't sleeping again that night. I sat in the chair near the table, flashlight in hand, listening. The wind rattled the tin roof now and then, but otherwise it was dead silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. I stayed that way until light finally started to creep through the window. When morning came, everything looked almost normal again. The fog had lifted, the smell faded, and birds had returned somewhere in the distance. I stepped outside, half expecting to see nothing unusual, but the ground near the graveyard gate caught my eye again. The dirt was freshly disturbed, a small patch of turned soil that hadn't been there the day before. I walked closer, my boots sinking slightly. There were footprints too, not clear ones, but heavy impressions leading from the gate toward the cabin, and then back again. I followed them as far as I could, but they disappeared into the wet grass near the fence line. That sour smell lingered faintly in the air, just enough to make my stomach twist. I didn't stay another night. I packed up everything, locked the cabin, and left before noon. On my way out of town, I stopped at the local gas station to fill up. The clerk saw the dirt on my boots and said I must have been up by the old graveyard property. I nodded. He told me that a few years back, someone had tried to dig up part of the cemetery, looking for jewelry or bones or who knows what, and that the police had found a half-dug grave behind the fence, right about where the new dirt now was. They never caught who did it, he said. They just covered it back up. I didn't say anything, just nodded again and paid. The drive home felt longer than before, and even with the windows down, I couldn't get that smell out of my head. It clung to me somehow, in my clothes, my hair, maybe even in my thoughts. That night, back in my apartment, I dreamed of the cabin. I saw it from above, small and lonely, with the graveyard behind it. In the dream, the dirt near the fence kept shifting, like something moving slowly underneath. When I woke up, I could almost swear I still smelled wet soil. I haven't gone back since. The cabin's still mine, but I can't bring myself to see it again. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how that door was open just a little, and how those footprints stopped right before the steps. I tell myself it was just an animal or maybe someone passing through. But deep down, I know that whoever dug that grave hadn't finished. And maybe that night they were just checking to see if anyone noticed. It was the fall of 2004, somewhere deep in the Pacific Northwest, a few miles off a dirt road that most people didn't even know existed. My name doesn't matter much now, but back then I was 27, and I had this idea that I could live alone for a while off the grid just to clear my head. I'd been working construction for years and figured I knew enough to build something simple. A small cabin, something solid enough to last through the wet seasons. I had no real plan, just a vague need to be away from everyone and everything. I found a small patch of land near a tree line beside a slow-moving creek. It wasn't much, just dense forest and endless mud when it rained. The nearest town was almost an hour away, and I could go days without hearing a car engine. Felt like a perfect place to disappear for a while. By mid-October, I had most of the structure done. It was rough, uneven in places, but it stood straight enough. The walls were made from cut pine logs I'd split myself, sealed with tar and old cloth. The roof was tin, secondhand sheets I'd hauled in the back of my truck. It made a racket every time it rained, but I kind of liked the sound. It reminded me that I'd built something that could stand against it. That night, the rain started early, around 7, just as the light was fading. I'd finished cutting some boards for shelving inside and was too tired to do more. I had a small propane lantern and a single cot with an old wool blanket. The air was damp and cold, and every time I exhaled, I could see my breath drift through the beam of light. I remember the smell of wet wood and mud filling the cabin. The rain didn't just fall. It poured. It was the kind that drowns every other sound. You can't hear the trees, you can't hear your own boots on the floor. Just rain hammering the roof, and somewhere outside, water collecting in little streams and puddles. I sat on the cot, staring at the lantern flame dance against the wall, and thought about how quiet it would be if it all stopped. After about an hour, I noticed something. It wasn't the rain itself, it was what I didn't hear. Usually, the creek outside made this steady sloshing sound, especially after heavy rain, but now it was gone. Just the roof noise. I figured maybe the rain drowned it out, but something about it felt off. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and decided to step outside. The second I opened the door, the wind shoved cold water in my face. The rain was thick, coming down in heavy sheets. I had to squint just to see a few feet ahead. The ground around the cabin had turned into brown water and soft mud. My boots sank with every step. When I got close to the creek, the beam of my flashlight hit what looked like moving earth. The water was higher than usual, almost spilling over its banks. It was running faster, carrying branches, mud, and leaves with it. I realized then that if it kept raining through the night, the creek could flood up to the cabin. I turned back to head inside, and that's when I noticed something strange near the treeline. It was just a shape, barely visible through the curtain of rain, dark, still maybe 10 feet tall. My first thought was that it was a dead tree I hadn't noticed before, but when the lightning flashed, I saw it wasn't a tree. It was a tarp, a blue one, torn at the edges, tied up between two trees. I didn't remember ever putting that there. I walked closer, each step sucking deeper into the mud. The tarp fluttered hard in the wind. I figured maybe some campers or hunters had been around before me, left it there. When I got near enough, I could see something underneath, a pile of wood or maybe old gear. I crouched down, shining the light, and froze. There were tools under it, rusted old ones, a hammer, a saw, some nails still in their box. And beside them, a pair of boots, half buried in mud. They weren't mine. The boots were worn out, split open near the toes, but they looked like someone had left them there not too long ago. There were faint marks in the mud around them, like footprints, but the rain had already washed most of them away. I stood there, soaked to the bone, trying to figure out if someone else had been using this spot before me. I took the tarp off to see if there was more underneath. There was a rotted sleeping bag, flattened and dark with water. The smell hit me first, old mold, wet earth, and something metallic. I didn't want to touch it again, but my light caught a tin cup lying beside it. It had dry dirt inside, like it had been sitting there for months. Whoever had been here had lived rough. That was enough for me. I backed away, pulled the tarp back over the pile, and walked quickly to the cabin. Inside, I changed out of my wet clothes, wrapped myself in the blanket, and sat there listening to the rain hammer on the roof. My mind kept going back to those boots. I wondered who they belonged to, if maybe they'd lived here before, and if they'd left in a hurry. Around midnight, the storm got worse. The tin roof shook, and every gust of wind made the walls creak. Couldn't sleep. I just kept staring at the lantern, waiting for the rain to ease. Then I heard something that made my stomach tighten. A sharp thud outside, then another. It sounded like something heavy being dropped in the mud. I didn't move for a while. The rain covered most sounds, but those dull thumps came again, spaced out, closer to the cabin. My flashlight was still on the small shelf. I picked it up, turned the lantern off, and stood there in the dark. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. For a long minute, there was nothing, just the storm. Then I heard what sounded like footsteps, slow, uneven, like boots dragging through mud. I told myself it was probably a branch blown loose or a deer moving through, but deer don't make that kind of rhythm. I went to the window, a small square hole I'd covered with a plastic sheet and shined my light through. The rain made it hard to see, but I could just make out movement near the treeline. Something pale against the dark, shifting slightly. It wasn't tall, maybe shoulder height, but I couldn't make out what it was. I stood there, light shaking in my hand, waiting for it to move again. But after a few seconds, it was gone. Just rain and trees again. I stayed awake the whole night, too wired to close my eyes. By morning, the rain had stopped. Everything outside was gray and quiet. Mist hung over the trees, and the ground looked chewed up from all the flooding. I went out to check the creek first. It had risen almost to the cabin steps but hadn't flooded inside. The tarp was still there, half torn off, flapping in the breeze. When I walked closer, I noticed something new. One of the boots I'd seen under the tarp was gone. The other was still there, half buried in mud, but the second one was missing. I looked around, but the rain had washed away any tracks that might have been there. That moment changed something for me. I packed what little I had left inside. A few tools, some food, the lantern, and loaded it all into the truck. The ground was soft, and the tires spun before they caught grip. But I didn't stop until I hit the main dirt road. I never went back to that spot again. I sold the land later that year. Sometimes, when I think about that night, I wonder if maybe someone had been living there long before me, if they came back to see who was using their place. Maybe they didn't like what they found. All I know is that after that night, I couldn't stand the sound of heavy rain on a tin roof again. It always brought me back to that cabin, to that dark shape in the trees, to those missing boots, and to the feeling that I wasn't alone out there after all. It was October 2019 when I decided to spend a week alone in a rented cabin up in the Scottish Highlands. I'd been working non-stop in London, drained by noise, deadlines, and people. I just wanted quiet, no phone service, no neighbors, no city lights. I found the place on an old cabin rental site. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin near a loch, with hills and thick pine trees surrounding it. The owner emailed me brief instructions and said to collect the keys from a small lockbox nailed near the back porch. I didn't think much of it. It took me almost 12 hours to drive there. The last stretch was rough. A narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my car, winding through endless forest. By the time I reached the cabin, it was evening. The air was cold, the sky cloudy, and everything felt oddly still. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of gravel under my tires. The cabin looked older than the pictures. Dark timber, moss on the roof, a few broken shingles, and one window shutter hanging loose. I parked beside a rotting wooden fence, grabbed my backpack, and walked up the short steps to the porch. The lockbox was there, exactly as the owner said. I took the key and went inside. The interior was small but functional. One main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen corner, and a single bedroom with a low ceiling. There was a faint smell of damp wood and old smoke. The fridge worked, the lights flickered but stayed on, and there was a small heater near the wall. I unpacked some food, checked the place for mice or leaks, then sat on the couch for a while just listening to the quiet. The first night was peaceful. I heard nothing but rain on the roof and the occasional creak from the old boards. The next morning, I went for a walk along the edge of the loch. The water was still, gray like metal, and the trees reflected perfectly in it. There was a chill in the air that felt heavier than normal, like something was pressing down on the place. That evening, while I was cooking a simple meal, I heard something outside. Not footsteps exactly, more like the sound of someone dragging their boots through wet leaves. It moved slowly, stopping every few seconds. I turned off the stove and listened. It was too rhythmic to be an animal. I looked out through the small kitchen window, but all I could see was darkness and the faint reflection of my face. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe someone hiking nearby, but there shouldn't have been anyone out there. The nearest town was miles away. Still, I locked the door and tried not to think about it. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud near the side of the cabin. Human footprints, barefoot. The size looked almost identical to mine, maybe slightly smaller, but the strange part was that the toes looked spread out and long, like someone had been walking barefoot on uneven ground for years. There were no shoe prints, no other markings, just those bare footprints leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin, then turning back toward the woods. That sight made my stomach drop. I crouched down to get a better look, and the mud was still slightly wet. The prints weren't old. Someone had been there during the night. I scanned the forest line for any sign of movement, but the trees stood silent. I thought about packing up right then and leaving, but it was early, and my car was parked on a narrow muddy track that would be slippery in daylight. I decided I'd wait it out one more night and leave early in the morning. By evening, the rain returned. I lit a small fire in the fireplace and tried reading a book, but I couldn't focus. My ears kept catching small noises, branches snapping, faint rustling, like someone moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was the wind, but then I heard a soft, uneven tapping on the side wall. Not from the door, the wall. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. I froze, my whole body tense. The fire crackled behind me. I didn't move. The tapping came again, slightly higher this time, like whoever was doing it was slowly testing different spots on the cabin. I walked quietly to the window and looked out, but it was pitch black. My flashlight beam only reached a few meters, lighting up fog and wet grass. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made my pulse race. Around 3 a.m., I heard something scrape along the porch, a slow dragging sound, like someone's heel or a stick being pulled across the wooden boards. I sat up and grabbed the small camping knife I'd brought. My dog, if I'd brought him, would have gone mad barking at that. But I was alone, and the silence was unbearable. When the sun finally came up, I went outside. The footprints were back. More of them this time. They circled the cabin, overlapping, some pressed deep into the mud. I followed them a few steps into the woods, but they disappeared after about 10 meters. Then I noticed something hanging from one of the trees. A torn piece of fabric, pale and soaked, like it had been ripped off clothing. It looked almost like part of a shirt sleeve. I didn't want to touch it, but I recognized the brand logo printed faintly on it. The same brand of shirt I'd been wearing the day before. That's when I realized it wasn't just someone passing by. Whoever had been out there was watching me, closely enough to notice what I was wearing, closely enough to imitate it. I decided to leave. I threw my stuff into my backpack and went to start the car. The road back was muddy, the tires spinning for a few seconds before catching traction. As I reversed down the narrow path, I caught something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing between the trees at the edge of the clearing. Tall, barefoot, pale against the dark background. It wasn't moving, just standing, watching. I didn't stop. I kept my eyes on the mirror until the trees swallowed the cabin from view. My hands were shaking the whole drive back. When I reached the nearest gas station 2 hours later, I told the clerk someone had been around my cabin at night. He said it wasn't the first time he'd heard that. A few hikers had gone missing up that way in recent years. Police said it was wild animals or people getting lost, but locals whispered about a man who lived deep in the woods. Someone who used to be part of a survivalist group decades ago and never came back. They said he'd learned to live off the land, and sometimes he'd watch the cabins for food or clothes, moving quietly between the trees. I didn't go back to check. I didn't report it to the police either. I just wanted to get home and forget the whole thing. But for weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the image of that figure, the way it stood perfectly still, the way it looked too much like me in shape and size. I sold my camping gear, deleted the rental site from my bookmarks, and avoided any road that led into the highlands again. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm half asleep, I think about those footprints, the way they matched mine almost perfectly. And I wonder if whoever was out there was studying me long before I noticed. Maybe they had followed me up that road. Maybe they'd watched me step out of my car, take the key from the lockbox, and copy every step I made until they knew exactly how to move like me. Not some creature, not a ghost, just a man. A human who'd lived too long in the woods, long enough to forget how to be one. And when I think about that, the silence of that cabin doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels like something breathing, slow and patient, waiting for another car to pull up. It was late September of 2012 when I decided to take a solo weekend trip into the hills outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. I was 29 back then, working long hours at a warehouse, and I needed a break from everything, from the noise, from the constant routine, from people. I'd been feeling burned out, and someone at work had mentioned an old logging trail that led deep into the woods, miles from any towns. He said there were some old hunting cabins scattered out there, long abandoned since the 1970s. That idea stuck in my head. I figured I'd go up there, camp a bit, hike, maybe stay in one of those old cabins if it was still standing. I wasn't looking for an adventure, just peace and quiet. I left on a Friday morning, the back of my old Chevy loaded with basic camping gear, a sleeping bag, some canned food, a small hatchet, and a flashlight. The drive was long and winding. The farther I went, the narrower the roads became. By afternoon, the paved road ended and turned into gravel, and eventually, that turned into a dirt trail lined with pine trees so tall and dense that the sunlight barely reached the ground. The air was crisp but dry, and everything smelled like pine sap and old bark. The forest out there felt untouched, not the kind of place hikers often visit. I drove until I couldn't anymore. The dirt trail ended abruptly at a clearing, and beyond that was a faint path leading into thicker woods. I parked the truck, threw my backpack on, and decided to follow that narrow trail on foot, hoping it would lead me to one of those cabins I'd heard about. Took me nearly an hour of walking before I saw anything. The path curved uphill, and through the trees, I noticed a dark shape sitting in the distance. As I got closer, it became clearer. A small wooden cabin, the kind built from rough logs, weathered and gray from years of sun and rain. The roof sagged a bit in the middle, moss clinging to its edges. One of the window frames was cracked, the glass shattered. There was an old porch, its boards splintered, half buried under fallen pine needles. I stood there for a while just looking at it. Something about it felt strange. Not scary exactly, but heavy. Like the air around it was still, thicker somehow. There were no birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just the faint sound of the wind brushing through the pines. Inside, it was worse. The air was stale and carried a faint smell of mold and dust. The cabin had one main room with a small kitchen area in the corner, a wood stove, and a single metal-framed bed with a dirty mattress half torn open. There were old cans stacked on a shelf, their labels faded beyond reading. A few animal bones lay near the fireplace, maybe left from someone's meal decades ago. I checked the place thoroughly before deciding to stay. I figured I'd clean up a bit, set up my sleeping bag on the floor instead of the mattress, and make it livable for the night. The structure was still solid, and with a small fire going in the stove, it would be warm enough. By sunset, I had a small fire burning and had eaten one of my canned meals. The light outside faded fast, and soon the only light inside came from the stove's small orange glow. I sat there, listening to the fire crackle, feeling the wood creak every so often as it settled. I remember feeling uneasy, but I brushed it off as normal nerves. Being alone out in the woods can make anyone a little tense. But as the night went on, I started hearing things. At first, it was soft, A faint crunch of leaves somewhere outside, slow and irregular, like footsteps, but too far apart to be a person walking. Then silence. Then another crunch, closer. I froze, listening. The woods outside were pitch dark now, the kind of dark that made the window just a black square. I turned off my flashlight to see if I could spot any light outside. Maybe someone's lantern, but there was nothing. I waited maybe 5 minutes, maybe more. Then I heard it again, that same crunch, closer this time, and then the sound of something brushing against the porch railing. The wood creaked slightly. I felt my chest tighten. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly pointed it toward the window. The beam caught the reflection of something metallic, just for a split second. Then nothing. I stayed still for a long time. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably just an animal and that I'd scared it off. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to sleep, but it didn't last. Around midnight, I woke up to another sound, this one sharper. Came from inside. It sounded like something had scraped against the floorboards near the kitchen. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The fire in the stove had burned down, leaving only a faint orange glow. I grabbed my flashlight again and shined it toward the sound. There was nothing there, just the same empty room. But then I noticed something. The door I had closed earlier was slightly open. Not much, just a few inches, enough for cold air to seep in. I was sure I had bolted it before lying down. I walked over, checked it, and pushed it shut again, jamming a small piece of firewood against it to keep it from moving. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every small creak or noise made me jump. When morning finally came, I went outside to look around. There were tracks in the dirt, not animal tracks, but boot prints. They led from the trees toward the cabin and back again. They weren't mine. The treads were different. I stood there for a long time staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Whoever it was had been walking around the cabin during the night. Maybe they had been the one on the porch. I decided not to stay another night. I packed up quickly and started heading back toward where I'd parked my truck. But when I got there, I found something that made my stomach drop. My driver's side door was open, not all the way, just cracked. I knew I had locked it. My backpack, which I'd left in the passenger seat, was gone. There were muddy footprints near the truck, leading off into the woods on the other side. I stood there, frozen, feeling a wave of anger and fear. Someone had been watching me that whole time, probably from the moment I walked into those woods. Maybe they'd been living out there, maybe they used the cabin sometimes, or maybe they just liked to watch people who wandered too deep in. I didn't bother following the footprints. I got in the truck, slammed the door, and drove out of there as fast as the road would let me. Every mile I put between me and that cabin, I felt like I could breathe a little more. I never went back. A few weeks later, I told a friend about it. Just the basics, not all the details. He said he'd heard something similar years ago, that there were squatters or drifters living in those woods, people who didn't want to be found. It made sense. The old cabins provided shelter, and no one came up there much anymore. Even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes. The sound of those footsteps, the door cracked open, the footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. What gets me the most isn't the thought that someone tried to steal from me. It's that they didn't take much, just the backpack. They could have taken the truck, or worse, they could have done something while I was sleeping. But they didn't. They just watched. And that's what bothers me most. Knowing that whoever it was, they were close enough to touch the door handle, close enough to hear me moving inside, and they decided to wait. Maybe they were curious, maybe just patient, or maybe they were testing how deep I'd go before realizing I wasn't alone. That cabin still stands, probably, somewhere in those woods, silent and sinking slowly into the ground. But I'll never know. I'll never step foot on that road again. It was early autumn of 2017 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone at my uncle's old farm in northern Kansas. The farm had been empty for almost 4 years since he moved into town after his wife passed. He told me I could stay there if I wanted a break from the city. I had just quit my job at a construction company in Wichita, and I figured some time away from people would clear my head. The farm was isolated, 20 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by endless fields of dry grass, patches of corn, and rows of old oak trees along a dirt road that no one really used anymore. The main house was old but strong, built from heavy pine boards that had darkened over the years. Behind it sat a small wooden cabin that my uncle used to rent out to travelers or farmhands decades ago. That's where I decided to stay. It was smaller, quieter, and separate from the main house. It had a simple setup: a bed, a small kitchen area, a bathroom, and a single window facing the back field. I parked my truck by the barn, unpacked a few bags, and got settled before sundown. That first night was calm. The air smelled like dry soil and hay. I could hear crickets outside, and the occasional lowing of cows somewhere far off. I slept early, the quiet pressing in so hard it almost felt heavy. The only sound inside the cabin was the faint ticking of an old wall clock. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The light came in through the window, cutting through the dust that hung in the air. I made some coffee and decided to walk around the property. The barn was about 50 yards away, still full of old tools and broken machinery. There was a chicken coop beside it, though it hadn't been used in years. Weeds had grown around the fence, and part of the roof had caved in. Everything felt untouched, frozen in time. As I walked along the fence line, I noticed something odd in the far corner of the field. 2 wooden posts standing upright, with a few thin boards nailed across them like a makeshift gate. It didn't connect to anything, just sat there, half covered by weeds. I figured my uncle must have started building another section of fence years ago and never finished it. It wasn't unusual out here to find half-done projects left behind. By the 3rd night, things started feeling different. The cabin felt colder inside, even though the weather hadn't changed. I kept hearing soft movements outside after dark, like footsteps in the dirt or the faint creak of wood shifting. I tried to brush it off as animals. Coyotes, raccoons, maybe even deer wandering through. But something about the rhythm of the sounds made it hard to ignore. It wasn't the random scuffling of an animal. It was slower, more deliberate, like someone walking and stopping every few steps. One night around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. There was a faint scraping sound coming from the back of the cabin, right beneath the window. My heart started pounding. I stayed completely still, trying to listen. The scraping went on for a few seconds, then stopped. I didn't move. After what felt like forever, I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it out the window. Nothing, just the fields stretching out into blackness. The only thing I saw were the tops of the weeds swaying in the wind. The next morning, I went outside to check. The dirt beneath the window looked disturbed, like something had been dragged there. There were faint marks, almost like shoe prints, but not deep enough to be sure. I felt uneasy, but I tried to shake it off. I told myself maybe it was an animal again, or maybe I had done it myself and forgotten. But the thought stuck in my mind all day. I started keeping the cabin door locked all the time, even during the day. At night, I made sure the windows were shut tight. Still, every evening the same thing happened. The faint noises outside, the feeling of being watched. It was never loud, never direct, but always just enough to make my nerves crawl. On the 5th night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the cabin. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, soft footsteps, moving slowly around the side of the cabin. I held my breath. The steps stopped near the window. I didn't move. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, or maybe it was just the wind slipping through the cracks. I waited, frozen. Then there was a faint metallic sound, like something scraping against the window frame. I jumped up and shone the flashlight straight toward the glass. Again, nothing, just darkness outside. When morning came, I checked the window frame. There was a thin scratch across the wood, fresh and pale against the dark surface. That's when I decided to check the rest of the property carefully. I walked along the edge of the fields, checked behind the barn, the chicken coop, and even that strange wooden gate in the corner of the field. That gate looked different now. The boards that had been nailed across it were gone, lying flat on the ground, and the weeds around it looked trampled down like someone had been standing there. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep inside the cabin. I sat in my truck instead, parked near the barn with the headlights facing the cabin. Around midnight, I saw something move at the edge of the field. A figure, tall and thin, moving slowly between the rows of weeds. It wasn't close enough to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of a person. The figure stopped near the cabin, stood still for a long time, then disappeared toward that broken gate. I didn't move from the truck until the sun came up. When I finally got out, I went straight to the gate again. The ground there had clearer footprints now, definitely human, bare feet, long and uneven. They led away from the field and disappeared into the line of trees. That was enough for me. I packed my things right then. Before I left, I went inside the cabin one last time to grab my flashlight. As I was locking the door, I noticed something written faintly on the inside of the wooden door frame. It looked like someone had carved it years ago with a knife. The letters were small and rough. "Keep lights on." I hadn't noticed it before, maybe because the wood was dark and worn, but it looked old. I drove back to Wichita that afternoon, too shaken to stop. When I told my uncle later what I'd seen, he went quiet for a long moment and then said the cabin had always made him uneasy too. He said he'd seen signs of trespassers before but never caught anyone. He thought it was just local drifters cutting through the property at night. A week later, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I called him again, asked if he'd gone back to check the place. He said no, he hadn't been out there since I left. But he mentioned something strange. The neighbor who lived 3 miles down the road had called him about noises coming from the fields at night again. The same slow, steady footsteps, the same faint light moving between the trees. I never went back to that farm. Every time I think about it, I still picture that broken gate standing alone in the weeds and those uneven footprints disappearing into the woods. Whoever or whatever was walking that land didn't belong there, and I don't think they ever left. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still remember that sound. The faint scrape under the window, the slow steps circling the cabin. And I can't help but wonder how long it had been watching me before I ever noticed.